Something happened in the American wilderness that no one has ever been able to fully explain. Not the FBI, not the state police, not the forensic scientists who spent years trying to piece it together. And the deeper you go into this story, the more you realize that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to haunt you. It started with a group of people who simply vanished. No warning, no struggle, no clear cause of death, just silence, just frozen ground and broken trees, and evidence that pointed in every possible direction except toward an answer. And when investigators finally found what was left, the things they discovered did not bring them closer to the truth. They only made the terror deeper. This is not one story. This is the story of America's own wilderness nightmare. A case so similar to the infamous Dyatlov Pass incident in Russia that researchers have quietly been studying it for decades. A case that raises questions about what truly lurks in the deep forests and frozen mountains of the United States. A case where the wilderness itself seemed to fight back, and no one who has studied it carefully has ever walked away feeling safe again. Let's start at the beginning, and I need you to understand something before we go any further. The people involved in this story were not reckless. They were not amateurs. They were experienced, trained, and careful. That is what makes what happened to them so deeply disturbing. Because if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. The year was 1978. A group of 6 young men and women from a university outdoor program in the Pacific Northwest packed their gear and headed into the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. They were experienced hikers. 3 of them had led wilderness expeditions before. They had maps, they had proper equipment, they had a planned route, and a scheduled return date. The university knew exactly where they were going, and on the 5th day, they simply stopped returning radio signals. At first, no one panicked. Weather in the Cascades could knock out communication. It had happened before. The team leader was known for pushing schedules by a day or 2. People waited, and then they waited more. And then on the 9th day, when there was still no contact and no sign of the group returning to the trailhead, the search and rescue teams were finally sent in. What they found when they reached the group's last known campsite stopped them cold. The tents were still standing. The sleeping bags were still inside. The food was still packed and largely untouched. The fire had burned out days earlier, but the most disturbing thing was not what was there. It was what was not there. The people were gone. 6 experienced hikers had walked away from their camp in the middle of the night in freezing temperatures, without their gear, without their food, without any apparent reason, and they had walked in 6 completely different directions. Search and rescue teams spread out. They followed the trails left in the snow, and one by one, over the next 4 days they found them. Not together, not in any logical place. The first body was discovered nearly 2 miles from the camp, high on a ridgeline that the group had never planned to visit. The second was found in a shallow ravine, face down. The third was sitting upright against a pine tree, hands folded in his lap, eyes open, as if he had simply chosen to sit down and wait for something only he could see. None of them had died from the cold. That was the first impossible detail the medical examiner noted. The temperature that night had dropped to well below freezing, and yet the physical evidence suggested these people had been warm when they died. Several of them had removed layers of clothing. One woman had taken off her boots entirely, in the snow, in the dark, miles from camp. The examiner called it paradoxical undressing, a known phenomenon in hypothermia cases, where the dying person suddenly feels intensely hot and begins removing their clothes. But here's the problem. 3 of the 6 victims showed no signs of hypothermia at all. So what killed them? 2 of the 6 showed signs of severe internal injuries, broken ribs, fractured sternum, hemorrhaging in the chest cavity. But there was no external bruising, no cuts, no scrapes, no signs of a fall or a fight. The injuries looked, according to one forensic specialist, as if the victims had been placed under enormous pressure, as if something had squeezed them from the outside with a force that would require either a massive mechanical device or something far too large and far too powerful to exist in those mountains. The case was quietly classified as an accident, misadventure in the wilderness. The families were told their loved ones had gotten lost, panicked, and died from exposure and the consequences of disorientation in extreme cold. But 2 of the lead investigators on the search team never accepted that explanation. One of them, a veteran mountain rescue specialist, who had worked dozens of wilderness fatalities in his career, later said in an interview that he had never seen anything like it, that in 30 years of wilderness rescue work, he had never found a scene that raised so many questions with so few answers. He noted something else, something that had been left out of the official report. Around the campsite and along several of the trails where the bodies were found, there were areas of broken and scorched vegetation, not burned by fire, scorched, as if exposed to sudden intense heat from above. Patches of pine needles had turned brown and fallen. Small branches had snapped outward, away from a central point, as if something had passed through the air above and created a powerful pressure wave. He had photographed these areas himself, and when he tried to submit those photographs as part of the official record, he was told they were not relevant. He kept copies. Now, here is where this story starts to spiral, because this was not the only case of its kind in American wilderness history, not even close. And the similarities between these incidents across different states, different decades, and different landscapes are the kind of thing that, once you see them, you cannot unsee. In 1959, the same year the Dyatlov Pass incident occurred on the other side of the world, a group of hunters in northern Minnesota disappeared under circumstances that were never fully explained. 4 men, experienced outdoorsmen, they vanished from their campsite overnight. Their gear was left behind. 2 were found dead miles apart. 1 was found alive, but was completely unable to speak coherently for 3 days. When he finally did speak, he described hearing a sound unlike anything he had ever heard before. He called it a pressure, not a noise. Something that he said he felt in his chest before he heard it anywhere else. He said the sound made him want to run, and so he ran, and he never stopped until he fell. He refused to ever return to that area of Minnesota. He moved to Florida the following spring and never discussed what happened again. In 1994, a solo backpacker in the Appalachian wilderness of North Carolina was found dead under circumstances eerily similar to the Washington state case. He had left his campsite in the night. He had removed his shoes. He was found 2 miles away in a sitting position, leaning against a tree, with internal injuries that matched no known cause. His journal, recovered from his tent, contained a final entry written sometime during his last night. The handwriting was erratic and hard to read, but investigators were able to make out several phrases. He wrote that the forest had gone completely silent, that even the wind had stopped, that the silence itself felt wrong, felt heavy, felt like it was pressing down on him. And then he wrote 4 words before the journal entry ended abruptly. 4 words that have never been explained. He wrote, "It is watching me." Search and rescue teams, park rangers, and forensic specialists have told similar stories across dozens of wilderness incident reports filed in the United States over the past 70 years. Experienced people entering wilderness areas and behaving in ways that are completely inconsistent with their training and their personalities. People removing clothing in freezing temperatures. People running away from safety. People found dead with internal injuries and no external trauma. People who experienced overwhelming panic without any visible cause. People who heard or felt something in the wilderness that left them unable to function rationally. The official explanations have always pointed to the same causes: hypothermia, altitude sickness, disorientation, carbon monoxide poisoning from improperly ventilated tents, infrasound from wind passing through geological formations, creating frequencies that trigger panic and paranoia in the human brain. All of these explanations have merit. All of them can account for some of what happened in some of these cases, but none of them can account for all of it. Not the internal injuries with no external trauma, not the scorched vegetation, not the body positions, not the 6 people who walked away from a safe, warm camp in 6 different directions in the middle of the night in freezing temperatures without a single one of them leaving any sign of why. There is a theory, discussed quietly in wilderness rescue circles and among independent researchers, that something exists in certain remote areas of the American wilderness that we do not yet understand. Not necessarily something supernatural, not necessarily something paranormal, but something. Perhaps something geological, perhaps something electromagnetic, perhaps something atmospheric. Something that interacts with human biology and human psychology in ways that produce terror, disorientation, irrational behavior, and ultimately death. something that leaves almost no trace, something that is nearly impossible to study because the areas where it occurs are so remote and so dangerous that getting researchers in after the fact is nearly impossible. Or perhaps it is something else entirely. Perhaps it is something older than our understanding of the world, something that has always been in those mountains and those forests, something that the indigenous peoples of North America knew to avoid, something that does not show up on any map or in any scientific textbook, but that experienced wilderness guides have quietly warned about for generations.
Stay out of certain valleys. Do not camp on certain ridgelines. Do not go into those mountains after the first snow. Do not go alone.
And do not, under any circumstances, go in if the birds stop singing. The families of the victims in the 1978 Washington state case never received the full investigative file. A Freedom of Information Act request filed by one of the victims' sisters in 2003 returned heavily redacted documents. Large sections of the forensic analysis were blacked out. The photographs taken by the veteran search and rescue specialist were not included in the released documents at all. His copies remain in a private archive. The case was never officially reopened. The families were never given a full explanation, and the mountain range where those 6 people died is still there, still open to hikers, still beautiful in the photographs that outdoor enthusiasts post online every summer. And every year, a small number of people who enter that area come back reporting something wrong, something they cannot quite describe, a feeling, a sound they heard at night that they could not identify, an area of the forest where the animals went completely quiet, an overwhelming urge to leave, to run, to not look back. Most of them listen to that urge. They pack up and they leave, and they try to forget about it, and most of them succeed mostly. The feeling fades. Life goes on. The wilderness stays where it is, deep and cold and indifferent. But some of them don't forget. Some of them spend years thinking about what they heard in those mountains. Some of them reach out to each other quietly, through online forums and private groups, trying to figure out if what they experienced was real or imagined, trying to find others who felt it too, trying to understand what is out there in the American wilderness that has no name and leaves no evidence, and has been killing people and walking free for longer than anyone wants to admit. The search and rescue specialist who kept those photographs died in 2011. He left behind a small collection of notes and files related to wilderness incident cases he had worked over his career. Among those files was a handwritten letter addressed to no one in particular. In that letter, he wrote that he had spent 30 years trying to find a rational explanation for what he saw in those mountains in 1978. He wrote that he had consulted with physicists and biologists and psychologists and geologists. He wrote that he had read everything he could find about unusual atmospheric phenomena and electromagnetic anomalies and infrasound research. And he wrote that in the end, after all of those years and all of that research, he had only become more certain of one thing, that whatever happened to those 6 young people in the Cascade Mountains in the winter of 1978 was not an accident. It was not exposure. It was not hypothermia. It was not disorientation. Something was there. Something found them, and it was not finished. The wilderness does not forget, it does not forgive, and it does not explain itself. Those mountains are still standing exactly where they stood the night 6 experienced. Careful, brilliant young people walked away from their tents and were never seen alive again. The trees are still there. The ridgeline where the first body was found is still there. And whatever moved through those forests that night, whatever silenced the birds and scorched the pines and squeezed the life out of 2 human beings from the inside without leaving a single mark on the outside, is still there too. At least that is what some people believe. So here's the question I want to leave you with tonight. And I want you to think about this carefully, because I think it matters. We live in the most technologically advanced era in human history. We have satellites that can photograph individual trees from space. We have equipment that can detect sounds too low for human ears to hear. We have forensic science that can extract information from a single cell. We have every tool imaginable for understanding our world, and we still cannot explain what happened to those 6 people. We still cannot explain the internal injuries with no external trauma. We still cannot explain why 6 experienced people walked away from safety in the dark. We still cannot explain the scorched vegetation, or the body positions, or the journal entry that ended with 4 words that someone wrote while they were still alive, and still trying to understand what was coming for them in the silence of the American wilderness. So what do you think was out there? What do you think is still out there? And if you ever find yourself deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road, and the birds suddenly go quiet, and the wind suddenly stops, and the silence starts to feel heavy and wrong, and like it is pressing down on you from above, what will you do?